The earliest origins of the Slavs, as of most of the peoples of Europe, has been a period of history traditionally shrouded in mystery. A time centuries before the first written records, our understanding has been traditionally shaped exclusively by archaeology. However, thanks to recent genetic evidence on many archaeological sites of this period, we now have at least a semi-complete understanding of what happened in between the first Yamnaya or Aryan migrations into Europe and the first written records in Europe. It's especially thanks to the genetic research that we have a good understanding of the first Slavic civilization in Europe, the Lusatian culture, Kultura Lusitania. Around 5500 BC, a large wave of settlers entered northern Europe from the south. Referred to as the Neolithic farmers, as they were the first people to have introduced agriculture into Europe. These peoples partially displaced the autochthonous Western hunter-gatherer population, although they soon settled into a new demographic status quo. In this period we find the remains of Neolithic farmers predominantly inland and in lowlands good for agriculture, especially in river valleys, and these formed a single culture in northern Europe called the linear pottery culture. The coasts and forests, meanwhile, as well as some of the wetlands, appear to have maintained their autochthonous Western hunter-gatherer character, with communities often living only a few dozen kilometers apart, but apparently having little to no contact other than the occasional minor integration of some Western hunter-gatherers into Neolithic farmer society. Over the centuries, the level of Western hunter-gatherer admixture in the linear pottery culture increased from only 5% to 12%, while we find the total absence of gene flow in the opposite direction. Around 5000 BC, the linear pottery culture collapsed, and the archaeological evidence shows us a large series of massacres and mass graves from this period, which appear to be the result of various wars between the peoples of the linear pottery culture, after which contact between various Neolithic farmer regions in northern Europe broke down. Population numbers severely declined in this period, and the linear pottery culture is replaced by a series of smaller cultures. Genetic evidence from Germany and other parts of Western Europe shows us that around 4400 BC, Western hunter-gatherers conquered these fractured Neolithic farmer states, succeeding the linear pottery culture, and Western hunter-gatherer haplogroups like I2A, which 80% of Western hunter-gatherers carried, became dominant and almost completely replaced the Neolithic haplogroups such as G2A, H2 and J2, despite the majority of overall ancestry remaining Neolithic. The culture formed from this conquest was called the funnel beaker culture, and a century later, around 4300 BC, the same process took place in Poland as Western hunter-gatherers conquered the local Neolithic peoples to form the Brzeszcz-Kujawski culture. While the same replacement of haplogroups was observed, the Brzeszcz-Kujawski culture maintained more of its Neolithic lifestyle and ancestry compared to the funnel beaker culture, and was noticeably similar to the stroked pottery culture to its southwest, a surviving remnant Neolithic culture. The Brzeszcz-Kujawski culture did not expand north like the funnel beaker culture, so a population of Western hunter-gatherers remained on the northern coast of Poland, while the Brzeszcz-Kujawski culture also had to contend with incursions from the funnel beaker culture in the south, elements of whom managed to settle in the lightly populated eastern foothills of the Carpathians. Around 3400 BC, the remaining Western hunter-gatherers appear to have conquered the Brzeszcz-Kujawski culture and funnel beaker remnants in Poland, and formed the globular amphora culture, which subsumed all of Poland. This culture had a higher Western hunter-gatherer ancestry than any of the other post-Neolithic collapsed cultures in northern Europe. It was these peoples of the globular amphora culture that the ancestors of the Balto-Slavs, the corded ware culture, encountered when they first migrated into the territory of modern Poland. The corded ware culture have a complicated origin related to the Yamnaya culture, with various competing theories, none of which have been conclusively proven. The corded ware share a common language and common basal eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry with the Yamnaya, who some have theorized that the corded ware are descended from. The corded ware first emerged around southern Belarus and Bryansk, north of the main Yamnaya homeland in Ukraine and the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Theories about their exact relationship to the Yamnaya usually involve speculation about the disparity in haplogroups between the two cultures. The Yamnaya predominantly had haplogroup R1b, with haplogroup R1a almost totally absent, while among the corded ware, haplogroup R1a was predominant, with a minority having haplogroup R1b. Based on this, some have speculated that the ancestors of the corded ware constituted a tribe or clan within the Yamnaya. Others speculated that the differentiation represented a class distinction within Yamnaya society, although this doesn't make as much sense when we consider the separation in their geographic distribution. It is also noticeable that the Yamnaya, whose lands bordered on the Caucasian mountains, have a certain level of admixture from the capture of Caucasian hunter-gatherer women, and this was absent in the more northern corded ware population. This difference lasts until the modern day, as the populations of Poland, Latvia and Lithuania still have significantly lower levels of Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry than populations in the rest of Europe, and the R1a haplogroup is still predominant in much of northeastern Europe. There was also a linguistic differentiation between the corded ware and the Yamnaya, known as the Centum-Sassum divide. Centum-speaking populations predominantly carry the R1b haplogroup, while Sassum populations predominantly carry haplogroup R1a. While corded ware descent today is most concentrated in the Baltic and Slavic peoples, the corded ware were also the ancestors of the Scythians and Sarmatians, as well as the Sintashta culture which spread European languages into India and Iran. The corded ware also contributed partially to the formation of the Germanic peoples. Unlike their geographic predecessors in the globular amphora culture who predominantly practiced sedentary agriculture, the corded ware lifestyle was dominated by nomadic pastoralism, assisted by their oxen-drawn wagons and domesticated horses absent to the globular amphora. This lifestyle persisted for the whole duration of the corded ware culture from 3000 BC to 2300 BC, although staple agriculture was also practiced to a lesser extent. The corded ware appear to have been a society of mobile war bands, and as such we find that the previous globular amphora culture is wiped out without a trace other than admixture from a certain number of globular amphora women into the corded ware population. A deeper dive into the history of the corded ware culture has been done elsewhere, and is outside of the scope of this video, so I'll skip to its end. The Yamnaya after 2800 BC slowly began to advance into Europe via Romania and up the Danube River, conquering the Baden culture, a Neolithic farmer remnant in Pannonia, to create the Bel-Beaker culture. The Bel-Beakers then spread into the corded ware territories in Germany, Denmark and Sweden between 2500 BC and 2200 BC. In its core in Poland, Belarus, Lithuania and western Ukraine, the corded ware did not collapse or be conquered, but rather gradually turned into more sedentary cultures that naturally separated over time as settled agriculture became more prominent. However, in the east, along with their northern neighbour the comb ceramic culture, a culture of eastern hunter-gatherers which had remained hunter-gatherers and had remained without any foreign genetic input, they appear to have been replaced after 2000 BC by migrating Uralic peoples who would displace the comb ceramic culture and become the ancestors of the modern Estonians and Finns. Genetic evidence suggests that these Uralic speakers, mostly carrying haplogroup N, gradually moved west over centuries, taking women from the autochthonous comb ceramic populations and to a lesser extent the corded ware in areas they settled while largely eliminating the men. Unlike the comb ceramic culture, the corded ware culture were not totally wiped out in the east, however, and in the Volga-Kama Valley they persisted in the Sintashta culture. The culture succeeding the corded ware in the area that would millennia later become the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, specifically the Mierzanowice culture, the Strzyżów culture, and the Trzciniec culture and Ivno cultures, did not leave a large amount of archaeological evidence for us. However, we are able to observe a gradual substitution of nomadic pastoralism for settled agriculture. By 1300 BC, these societies would coalesce into the Lusatian culture, the first society we can reliably refer to as Balto-Slavic. The earliest archaeological sites we find of the Lusatian culture, dating back to 1300 BC, are two sites in Lower Silesia, a grave in Domisław and a fortified multi-story building in Łubowice, as well as a site in Kwiatyniai, Lithuania, where large amounts of pottery and stored grain for winter were located. Genetic data from the Lusatian culture, meanwhile, provides us with a clear link between the corded ware and the medieval Slavs. The dominance of the R1a haplogroup continues uninterrupted, while genetic samples from the Lusatian culture show their closest modern relatives are the Slavic populations of Poland, Ukraine and Belarus. In the Tolenz Valley in Pomerania, we also have archaeological evidence for the largest battle in European history before the first millennium BC. In 1300 BC, around the time of the first emergence of the Lusatian culture, bones of over 1,000 people were found, mainly young men between the ages of 20 and 40. They appear to have been killed on the same day, and the remains of dead horses were also found. As the battle took place in the vicinity of a river, it is possible that the casualty number was much higher and that many of the bodies were simply washed away. The battle took place in the contact zone between the Lusatian culture and the Germanic cultures of the Nordic Bronze Age, and a significant number of the bronze arrowheads found at the site are rhombus-shaped with distinct tangs. These are not local to the Tolenz region, but are a typical design of the Lusatian culture in Moravia and Silesia. The majority of remains at the battle site contain the R1b and I2a haplogroups, with only a small presence of R1a, with this R1a component likely coming from the victorious side. Over half of the remains come from R1b or I2a individuals clustering with modern Celtic or Germanic populations, suggesting that a combined army of predominantly Germanic ancestry with the participation of a contingent from the Celtic Urnfield culture sustained the majority of casualties. We could also find some cases of individuals with R1b haplogroups who cluster closer to Slavs or intermediate between Slavs and Germans, who are in fact more numerous than those with haplogroup R1a found at the site. This suggests that there may have been some instances of Proto-Germanic peoples taking women from the Lusatian culture, which perhaps was a contributing factor to the battle, which appears to have been a successful attack by the individuals of the Lusatian culture against their Proto-Germanic neighbours. The Lusatian culture at this point likely consisted of a little over 500,000 people, so with an estimated army size of around 5,000 it would have included around 4% of the young male population, or over 10% of some subset or tribe of the Lusatian culture. A large number of bodies found at the Tolenz battlefield also had wounds from previous battles, suggesting perhaps a long war or series of conflicts leading up to this final battle, and likely serving as some kind of unifying event for the previously fractured peoples of the Lusatian culture, or at least for some tribe within it. It is possible that they practiced the later documented Proto-Slavic tradition of electing a chief or great leader only for times of war. As for their culture and lifestyle, we unfortunately know very little. We can perhaps assume it was similar to the later accounts of the Slavs beginning in the 1st century AD, when Greco-Roman historiography first shone its light on this region, but for this period itself, only archaeological evidence survives. The archaeology does, however, show us that the Slavs of the Lusatian culture cremated their dead and buried them in urns, a tradition which would continue into the time of the Proto-Slavs of the first millennium AD, and in fact until the proliferation of Christianity. Intensification of agriculture, like we see at the site in Květinje, is the source of the biggest lifestyle change of the Lusatian culture from preceding cultures. The emergence of the Lusatian culture brought with it more advanced methods of deforestation, transforming large areas of forest into agricultural land, as well as introducing crop rotation for the first time, and the large-scale proliferation of fortified settlements across Poland and surrounding areas. These were so prolific that the Baltic branch of this culture, which would separately evolve during the period of the Lusatian culture, would later be referred to as the Baltic Hillfolk culture. While the Lusatian culture was subdivided into various different geographic cultures, for example the appearance of knob ornamentation on pottery was only noted in the west, it was only the differentiation between Balts and Slavs which would leave a lasting mark to this day. But how and why did this differentiation emerge? The more intensive land use of the Lusatian culture is a clear sign of a significantly increased population, and this population, centered in fertile areas such as river valleys, became much less mobile. At the time, Masuria was also covered in large swamps unsuitable for agriculture, and this region formed a long barrier between most of the lands which would 2,000 years later become Piast Poland in the south and Lithuanian and Baltic Prussian lands to the north. Linguistic evidence also aligns with the period we find increased archaeological variation, as linguists estimate that the Slavic and Baltic languages diverged around 1000 BC, although both languages would have remained at least somewhat intelligible for the duration of the Lusatian culture. The real separation came like a tidal wave from the west. From the Sund, referred to by the Romans as the Spring of Nations, Germanic tribes had already begun pouring out into the south thanks to their rapid population expansion. At first they conquered and pushed out the Celtic tribes inhabiting northern Germany, but as early on as the 8th century BC, Germanic tribes had begun encroaching on the Slavic lands in Pomerania. It was essentially an earlier version of the Ostsiedlung, which would take place again 2,000 years later into the lands of the Kingdom of Poland and Bohemia. Before 700 BC, the entire Polish-Baltic coastline appears to have been occupied by the Germans, finally permanently severing the geographic link between the Balts and the Slavs, which would not be re-established for another millennia. In the last archaeological sites associated with the Lusatian culture, Biskupin in Kujawsko-Pomorskie and Wicina in Lubuskie, we find that both sites were violently destroyed and burned down by Scythian raiders, and then later reoccupied by German settlers. It was this joint pressure of Scythian raiders from the south, and predominantly Germanic migration from the west, which destroyed the Lusatian culture, and left in its place something totally foreign. Slavs were pushed to the eastern fringes of the known world, beyond the light of Greco-Roman history for centuries. This period of Slavic history, and the conflict of the Slavs with their new neighbours to the west and south, will be covered in detail in our next video on the history of the Slavs. Subscribe to find our content again.